There is a profound and comforting illusion that we all rely on every single night before we go to sleep. We walk around our homes, we turn off the kitchen lights, we make sure the stove is off, and we turn the deadbolt on the front door. We listen to the heavy metal click of the lock, and in that sound, we find an absolute sense of security. We believe that four walls and a locked door are enough to keep the chaos of the outside world completely separate from our safe, private lives. We believe that if danger ever tries to cross our threshold, there will be a loud struggle, a broken window, or enough time to dial 911. But what happens when the very place you feel the most secure becomes the site of an impossible vanishing? What happens when three grown women disappear from a small suburban house in the middle of the night, leaving behind their money, their cars, their clothes, and absolutely no sign of a struggle, as if they simply dissolved into the warm summer air? Before we unlock the doors to one of the most chilling and perplexing unsolved mysteries in American history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Springfield, Missouri, in the early summer of 1992, was the quintessential picture of Midwestern peace. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, kids rode their bikes down tree-lined streets until the streetlights came on, and violent crime was something that happened in other, bigger cities. June 6th was a particularly joyous day in Springfield. It was graduation day for the local high school. The air was thick with the humidity of early summer and the infectious excitement of hundreds of teenagers stepping into the adult world. Among those graduates were two beautiful, vibrant young women named Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall. Susie was 19 years old, known for her outgoing personality and her striking blonde hair. Stacy was 18 years old, a sweet, deeply loved young woman who was eagerly preparing for her upcoming college years. The two girls had been friends for a long time, and they had spent weeks planning the perfect way to celebrate their graduation night. Their original plan was to leave Springfield right after the graduation ceremonies and drive down to Branson, Missouri, where they had booked a hotel room. They were going to spend the weekend swimming, exploring, and celebrating with a large group of their classmates. But as graduation day wore on, those plans slowly began to unravel. The hotel in Branson fell through due to a miscommunication, and the girls found themselves without a place to stay for their highly anticipated weekend getaway. Instead of letting the ruined plans ruin their night, Susie and Stacy decided to stay in Springfield and hop between the various graduation house parties happening across town. They spent the evening laughing, dancing, and saying their goodbyes to classmates they might never see again. Around 2 a.m., the parties began to die down. The girls were exhausted. Stacy was originally supposed to sleep over at a different friend named Janelle's house, but Janelle's house was incredibly crowded with other teenagers who had the same idea. Susie suggested that they just go back to her house on Delmar Street. It would be quiet, they could wash off their makeup, and they could sleep in late. Stacy agreed, and she called her mother to let her know about the change of plans. The house on Delmar Street belonged to Susie's mother, a 47-year-old woman named Cheryl Levitt. Cheryl was a beloved local hairdresser, an incredibly hardworking single mother who had dedicated her entire life to providing for Susie. Cheryl and Susie shared a very close, trusting relationship. They were more like best friends than a traditional mother and daughter. While the girls had been out partying, Cheryl had enjoyed a quiet, relaxing evening at home. She had spent the afternoon painting a wooden dresser in the garage. Around 11:15 p.m., she had called a friend to chat, sounding perfectly happy and normal. After getting off the phone, Cheryl presumably washed up, put on her floral nightgown, and climbed into her bed, reading a book while her small Yorkshire Terrier, Cinnamon, curled up at her feet. She left the front porch light on, waiting for her daughter to come home. At roughly 2:15 a.m., Susie and Stacy arrived at the house on Delmar Street in their separate vehicles. They parked their cars in the curved driveway, right next to Cheryl's car. They walked up the pathway, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. What happened inside that house between the hours of 2:15 a.m. and 8 a.m. is a black hole of information that has terrified investigators for decades. The next morning, Sunday, June 7th, the sun rose hot and bright over Springfield. Janelle, the friend whose house the girls had initially planned to sleep at, woke up early. She had promised to meet Susie and Stacy that morning so they could all go to a nearby water park to spend the day together. When the girls did not show up at the agreed-upon time, Janelle assumed they had just overslept. She got into her car and drove over to the house on Delmar Street. When Janelle pulled up to the house around 9 a.m., she noticed that Susie's, Stacy's, and Cheryl's cars were all parked in the driveway. This made sense. They were home. They were just sleeping. Janelle walked up the short concrete path leading to the front door. As she stepped onto the front porch, she noticed something slightly odd. The glass globe that covered the front porch light was completely shattered. Small shards of jagged glass were scattered across the concrete welcome mat. Janelle carefully stepped over the glass and reached for the front door handle. She expected it to be locked, but when she turned the brass knob, it clicked open effortlessly. The front door was completely unlocked. Janelle pushed the door open and stepped into the living room. She called out for Susie and Stacy, her voice echoing in the quiet house. There was no answer. The only sound was the frantic, high-pitched barking of Cheryl's dog, Cinnamon. The little dog was running around the living room in a state of absolute distress. Cinnamon was usually a very calm dog, but this morning she was highly agitated, pacing back and forth and whining near the front door. Janelle walked further into the house. The television in the living room was turned on, emitting a quiet hum, but displaying only static snow. She walked into Susie's bedroom. The bed looked as though it had been slept in, but the room was empty. She walked into Cheryl's bedroom. Again, the bed covers were pulled back, but Cheryl was nowhere to be found. Janelle went into the bathroom. Sitting neatly on the bathroom counter were 2 wet washcloths, carefully folded over the edge of the sink. Beside them were Susie and Stacy's makeup remover pads. This indicated that the girls had indeed made it home safely, gone through their entire nighttime routine, and prepared for bed. Starting to feel a genuine sense of unease, Janelle went back into the living room. Sitting perfectly undisturbed on the coffee table were 3 purses. They belonged to Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy. Janelle looked inside them. Stacy's wallet still contained a large amount of cash from her graduation gifts. Cheryl's purse held her keys, her money, and a pack of cigarettes she never left the house without. Women do not leave their homes without their purses. They certainly do not leave without their money, their keys, and their cars. Confused and frightened, Janelle called Stacy's mother, Janice McCall. Janice had been waiting for her daughter to come home all morning. When Janelle explained that the girls were not at the house, but all their belongings were there, Janice immediately felt a cold spike of dread in her chest. She told Janelle to stay put, and she and her husband immediately drove to the house on Delmar Street. When Stacy's parents arrived, they searched the house frantically. They looked in the closets, the garage, and the backyard. There was absolutely no sign of the 3 women. The house was perfectly clean. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle whatsoever. It looked exactly like a home where the occupants had just stepped into the other room for a moment. In their panic, Stacy's parents made a decision that they would deeply regret for the rest of their lives. Hoping to find a clue as to where the girls might have gone, they began cleaning up the shattered glass from the front porch. They carefully swept the shards into a dustpan and threw them into the garbage, completely unaware that they were destroying the only physical piece of evidence left at a major crime scene. While they were waiting for the police to arrive, the telephone in the kitchen rang. Janelle answered it. The voice on the other end of the line was a man. He began speaking in a deeply disturbing, sexually explicit manner. The things he was saying were so horrible that Janelle immediately slammed the phone down in shock. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Janelle answered it. and it was the same man saying the same terrifying things. She hung up again. When the police finally arrived on the scene, they walked into a house that was now filled with panicked family members and friends. The crime scene, if it was one, had been completely compromised by people walking through the rooms, touching surfaces, and sweeping the porch. The detectives began their investigation by examining the answering machine in Cheryl's bedroom. The machine indicated that there was one new, unheard message. An officer pressed the play button. The tape whirred, and a message began to play. It was a very strange, cryptic message, but just as the investigators leaned in to listen closely, the officer's finger slipped. He accidentally hit the delete button instead of the save button. The tape completely erased. The message, and whatever crucial clue it might have held, was gone forever in a fraction of a second. Despite the blunders, the police realized they were dealing with a massive, unprecedented situation. 3 adult women do not voluntarily vanish from a locked house without taking a single personal item. The local authorities called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The quiet street was quickly swarmed with federal agents, crime scene technicians, and tracking dogs. The technicians dusted the entire house for fingerprints. They found nothing out of the ordinary. They sprayed the carpets and walls with luminol, a chemical that illuminates microscopic traces of blood that have been cleaned up. The house glowed completely dark. There was not a single drop of blood anywhere. The tracking dogs were given the women's clothing to pick up their scent. The dogs led the handlers out the front door, down the driveway, and into the street. But as soon as the dogs reached the pavement, the scent abruptly stopped. It did not fade away into the woods. It did not trail down the block. It stopped immediately, exactly where a vehicle would have been parked. This led investigators to a chilling, undeniable conclusion. Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy did not walk away from that house. They were placed into a vehicle and driven away. But how does someone kidnap 3 healthy, capable adults from a small house in a quiet neighborhood without making a sound? Cheryl was a fiercely protective mother. If someone had broken down the door and threatened her daughter, she would have fought to the death. The neighbors, whose houses were only feet away, reported hearing absolutely nothing that night. No screams, no barking dogs, no breaking glass. The detectives realized that the shattered porch light was the key to understanding the nightmare. It was not broken during a struggle. The glass was shattered before the women ever opened the door. The terrifying theory constructed by the FBI suggests that a predator, or perhaps a group of predators, had been watching the house on Delmar Street. They saw Cheryl go to sleep. They unscrewed or broke the porch-like globe to plunge the front entryway into absolute darkness. And then they waited. When Susie and Stacy arrived at 2:15 a.m., they walked up the dark path. They unlocked the door. They stepped inside, washed their faces, and got ready for bed. The prevailing theory is that the attacker was already inside the house, hiding in the dark, or that they knocked on the door shortly after the girls arrived, holding a weapon, and forced their way inside. To control 3 adults without a struggle, the attacker would have needed an overwhelming threat. They would have needed a firearm, and they would have needed the element of total surprise. The attacker woke Cheryl up, gathered the 3 terrified women in the living room, and quietly ordered them out the front door, threatening to shoot them if they made a single sound. They were marched out into the warm summer night, loaded into a waiting vehicle, and driven off into the dark, leaving their entire lives behind on the coffee table. Years passed. The case of the Springfield Three became one of the most heavily investigated missing persons cases in the country. The police received over 5,000 tips. They excavated concrete foundations of new parking garages looking for bodies. They drained local lakes. They interviewed known criminals who were active in the area at the time. A few men came forward with vague confessions, hoping to get lighter sentences for other crimes, but their stories were always full of inconsistencies and led to dead ends. To this day, over 30 years later, Not a single trace of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, or Stacy McCall has ever been found. No clothing, no jewelry, no bones. The house on Delmar Street still stands, a quiet, suburban monument to an impossible tragedy. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound and terrifying exploration of how incredibly fragile our sense of safety truly is. We build our homes, we buy our locks, and we go to sleep believing that we are the masters of our domain. But the truth is, the walls we build can only protect us from the things we can see coming. It teaches us a grim, vital lesson about the fleeting nature of our reality. The graduation parties, the laughter, the mundane act of taking off makeup, all of it was erased in a matter of minutes by an unseen darkness. It reminds us that we must hold on to the moments we have with the people we love with absolute sincerity. We must appreciate the quiet evenings, the mundane conversations, and the simple comfort of knowing our family is sleeping in the next room, because life is completely unpredictable, and the universe does not guarantee us a tomorrow. Sometimes, despite our best efforts and our locked doors, the outside world reaches in and takes everything, leaving nothing behind but questions that will never, ever be answered. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive ancient hotel in the middle of a bustling city and a series of security tapes that show a young woman playing a terrifying game of hide and seek with something no one else can see. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a very specific, undeniable dread that comes with staying in an old hotel. When you walk down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with identical wooden doors, you are walking through a gallery of hidden histories. You swipe your keycard, push open the heavy door, and drop your bags on the floor, rarely stopping to think about who was in that exact room the night before. You do not think about the arguments that echoed off the wallpaper, the quiet tears shed into the pillows, or the tragedies that might have unfolded just inches from where you are about to sleep. Most hotels clean away the physical evidence of the past, leaving only the scent of industrial bleach and fresh linen. But some buildings are too saturated with darkness. No amount of bleach can wash away the heavy, suffocating energy of a place that has seen too much pain. The Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles is one of those places. Before we unlock the doors to one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the winter of 2013. A 21-year-old college student named Elisa Lamb had decided to take a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. She was from Vancouver, Canada, and she was looking for an adventure. Elisa was a bright, curious, and expressive young woman who documented her life heavily on the internet. She maintained a blog where she wrote about art, fashion, and her personal struggles. She was navigating the difficult transition into adulthood and wanted to see the world on her own terms. Her trip brought her down to Southern California, and she needed an affordable place to stay in the heart of Los Angeles. She found a hostel called Stay on Main. What Elisa likely did not realize was that Stay on Main was simply a rebranded section of the infamous Cecil Hotel. Built in the 1920s, the Cecil was originally designed to be a luxurious destination for wealthy travelers and businessmen. But when the Great Depression hit, the hotel fell on incredibly hard times. The surrounding area, known as Skid Row, became heavily populated by the transient, the desperate, and the forgotten. The Cecil slowly transformed into a cheap, long-term boarding house. Over the decades, it earned a deeply sinister reputation. It became a magnet for tragedy, serving as the final residence for numerous people who chose to end their lives. It was the temporary home to infamous serial killers, who walked through the ornate lobby with blood on their hands, unnoticed by the staff. The building was a massive, towering monument to human suffering, holding nearly 700 rooms connected by a labyrinth of confusing hallways, dead ends, and dimly lit corridors. Elisa checked into the hotel on January 26th. Initially, she was placed in a hostel-style room with several other young female travelers. But within a few days, her roommates went to the front desk and complained about her behavior. They said she was acting erratically, leaving passive-aggressive notes on their beds and locking them out of the room. The hotel staff decided to move Elisa into her own private room on one of the higher floors. Elisa was very close with her parents back in Canada. She called them every single day of her trip to check in and let them know she was safe. But on January 31st, the day she was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel and travel to her next destination, the phone call never came. Her parents waited. They called her cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next morning, panic had completely set in. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their daughter missing. Because the area surrounding the hotel was notoriously dangerous, the police took the report very seriously. They dispatched officers to the Cecil Hotel to conduct a search. They knocked on the door of Elisa's private room. There was no answer. When they used a master key to enter, they found a scene that made absolutely no sense. All of Elisa's belongings were still in the room. Her luggage, her clothes, her laptop, and most importantly, her medication were all sitting there. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment to grab a cup of coffee and intended to return immediately, but she was gone. The police began a massive search of the massive, confusing building. They walked down every hallway. They knocked on doors. They brought in specialized search dogs to sniff the corridors. The dogs tracked her scent through the hallways, up to a certain window, and then the scent completely vanished. The police even checked the roof of the hotel. They found that the heavy metal doors leading to the roof were securely locked and heavily alarmed. If anyone tried to open those doors, a loud siren would immediately sound at the front desk. The alarms had not been tripped. There was no trace of Elisa Lam. 2 weeks passed. The story of the missing Canadian tourist hit the local news, but the police had zero leads. It was as if the sprawling, dark hotel had simply opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. Then, in a desperate attempt to gather information from the public, the police released a piece of security camera footage captured inside one of the hotel elevators. They hoped someone might recognize her or notice a clue they had missed. Instead, the video became a viral sensation of pure, unadulterated terror. The footage is deeply unsettling to watch. It is silent, grainy, and stamped with the date February 1st. It shows Elisa walking into the elevator. She is wearing a red zippered hoodie, a casual shirt, and dark shorts. She steps inside, casually leans forward, and presses a column of buttons. She does not press just one button. She presses a series of them, right down the middle row. She steps back and waits for the heavy metal doors to close. But the doors do not move. They stay completely open. Elisa steps forward and looks out into the hallway. Her movements are sharp, jerky, and deeply strange. She peers out to the left, then to the right, moving her head with a bird-like paranoia. She suddenly jumps back into the elevator and presses herself flat against the wall, hiding in the corner as if she is terrified that someone or something is coming down the hallway to get her. A few moments pass. The doors still refuse to close. She steps out into the hallway again. This time, she does a strange, square dance-like step. She steps out, steps back in, steps out again. She is looking at something, but the camera angle only captures the interior of the elevator and a small sliver of the hallway. Whatever she is looking at is just out of frame. She walks out into the hallway, standing just to the left of the open elevator doors. Then she begins to move her hands and arms in a bizarre, unnatural way. She twists her wrists, waving her fingers in the air as if she is treading water or casting a spell. Her hands contort and bend. She is clearly interacting with someone or something, but she is completely alone. Finally, she turns and walks away, disappearing down the dark hallway. The moment she is out of sight, the elevator doors finally, quietly, slide shut. The release of the video sent the public into a frenzy. Millions of people watched it, offering countless theories. Some believed she was being pursued by a killer who was standing just outside the camera's view, holding the elevator button to keep the doors open. Others pointed to the dark history of the Cecil Hotel, suggesting she was interacting with a sinister, invisible entity. Her unnatural hand movements and sheer terror seemed to defy any logical explanation. While the internet analyzed every single frame of the tape, a completely separate and horrifying situation was unfolding inside the hotel. Guests staying at the Cecil began calling the front desk with highly disturbing complaints. They said the water pressure in their rooms had dropped to a mere trickle. When they tried to take a shower, the water that came out of the showerhead was completely black. It looked like dark, muddy sludge. As the water ran, the color would eventually clear up, but the smell remained. The guests complained that the tap water smelled pungent, sweet, and metallic. When they brushed their teeth or drank from the sink, the water tasted putrid and completely foul. The complaints grew so numerous that the hotel management could no longer ignore them. On the morning of February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker was dispatched to investigate the plumbing. He took the elevator up to the top floor and used a secure stairwell to access the roof of the building. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was a vast, flat expanse of concrete and gravel. Sitting on top of a raised platform were 4 massive cylindrical water tanks. These tanks supplied the water for the guest rooms, the showers, and the kitchens below. They were huge metal structures, standing over 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The maintenance worker climbed a metal ladder to the top of the platform. He walked over to the first tank. He reached down and unlatched the heavy metal hatch that covered the opening at the top of the tank. He lifted the heavy lid, leaned forward, and looked inside the dark, echoing chamber. Floating face up in the water, inches from the top of the tank, was the decaying, naked body of Elisa Lamb. The worker scrambled backward in absolute horror. He immediately called the authorities. When the police and fire department arrived, the sheer logistics of the scene completely baffled them. The opening of the tank was so small, and the body was so swollen from being submerged in water for nearly 3 weeks, that they had to physically cut a hole in the side of the massive metal tank to drain the water and retrieve her remains. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves across the world. The guests inside the hotel realized with absolute terror that for the past 19 days they had been bathing in, brushing their teeth with, and drinking the water that contained a decomposing human body. But the horror of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the impossible mystery of how she got there. The police had checked the roof during their initial search, and the doors were locked and alarmed. To get to the roof without triggering the siren, someone would have had to navigate a complex labyrinth of fire escapes on the exterior of the building, climbing up several stories in the pitch-black night. Furthermore, the water tanks were towering structures. There was no fixed ladder leading from the concrete roof to the top of the specific tank where she was found. To look inside, you had to climb onto a platform, then haul yourself up the slippery, curved metal side of the tank. Once at the top, you had to lift a heavy metal hatch. Inside the tank, police found the red hoodie, the shirt, and the shorts Elisa had been wearing in the elevator video. They were floating in the water alongside her. The public immediately suspected murder. It seemed physically impossible for a petite young woman to navigate the fire escapes, scale an 8-foot water tank, open a heavy metal lid, strip off her clothes, jump into the water, and somehow close the heavy lid behind her. It seemed obvious that someone had chased her down the hallway, murdered her, carried her to the roof, and dumped her body into the tank to hide the evidence. The medical examiner took weeks to conduct a thorough autopsy and toxicology report. When the results were finally released, they provided an explanation that was far more tragic and realistically terrifying than any ghost story or murder plot. The autopsy revealed zero evidence of physical trauma. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle, and no defensive wounds. Furthermore, the toxicology report came back completely clean. There were no illegal drugs or alcohol in her system. However, the toxicology report did reveal something incredibly important. The levels of her prescribed medication in her bloodstream were extremely low. Elisa Lam suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Her condition required strict, daily medication to keep her brain chemistry balanced. When she traveled to Los Angeles, the change in routine, the stress of traveling alone, or perhaps a personal decision led her to stop taking her medication as prescribed. When a person with severe bipolar disorder stops taking their medication, they can fall into a deep, psychotic, manic episode. During these episodes, the brain begins to misfire. The person can experience vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a complete break from reality. They might believe they are being hunted. They might believe they have to hide. The haunting elevator video was not a recording of a woman interacting with a ghost or a killer. It was a tragic recording of a young woman trapped inside a terrifying hallucination created by her own mind. The reason the elevator doors did not close was not due to an invisible presence. In her frantic button pressing, she had hit the door hold button, which forces the elevator to stay open for 2 minutes. She was waving her hands and talking to a threat that felt entirely real to her, but existed only in her fractured consciousness. In a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, she fled the elevator. She navigated the confusing hallways of the Cecil Hotel. She found an open window or a fire escape door that bypassed the roof alarms. Driven by the intense delusion that she needed to hide from her unseen pursuers, she climbed the exterior of the building. She scaled the water tank. She opened the heavy lid and climbed into the water, seeking the ultimate hiding spot. Once she was inside the tank, the water was freezing cold. Hypothermia sets in very quickly in dark, cold water. As the body core temperature drops dangerously low, people often experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. The brain becomes so confused by the cold that it suddenly registers extreme burning heat, causing the victim to frantically strip off their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down. She removed her clothes. But the most terrifying realization of all was the water level. When she entered the tank, it was likely over half full. But the tank was essentially a giant metal barrel with smooth, slippery walls. There was no ladder on the inside. As the morning approached and the hotel guests woke up, they began to turn on their sinks and take their showers. As they used the water level inside the tank slowly began to drop. Elisa would have been treading water in the pitch-black darkness, shivering uncontrollably. As the water level sank lower and lower, the opening at the top of the tank moved further and further out of her reach. Her fingers would have scraped desperately against the slick metal walls, finding absolutely nothing to hold on to. She was trapped in an echoing, freezing, dark metal cylinder, screaming for help that would never come, until sheer exhaustion finally pulled her beneath the surface. The lid on top of the tank was likely never closed behind her. The initial reports of the maintenance worker finding the lid closed were corrected during the investigation. He had found the lid open exactly as she had left it when she climbed inside. The story of the Cecil Hotel and Elisa Lam leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound tragedy that strips away the comforting myths of monsters and ghosts, replacing them with the raw, devastating reality of mental illness. It teaches us a subtle, vital lesson about the immense vulnerability of the human condition. A person can be completely surrounded by hundreds of people in a massive hotel located in the middle of one of the most populated cities on Earth and still be entirely, hopelessly alone. It reminds us that the darkest, most terrifying places are not always found in the basements of old buildings or at the end of unlit hallways. Sometimes, the most inescapable prisons are built inside our own minds, waiting quietly for a moment of imbalance to lock the doors. Life requires us to be truly observant, to look past the surface of those around us, because we never know the terrifying battles someone might be fighting in the quiet isolation of their own reality. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is an unspoken agreement we all silently accept when we walk through the automatic sliding doors of a modern hospital. We believe that no matter how chaotic, dangerous, or unpredictable the outside world gets, the emergency room is a sanctuary. It is a fortress built entirely on science, reason, and sterile protocols. If you are bleeding, they have the tools to stop it. If your heart stops beating, they have the technology and the training to restart it. The doctors and nurses in those brightly lit corridors are our protectors. They stand between us and the absolute worst moments of our lives. But what happens when the threat does not come from a bullet wound, a car crash, or a known infection? What happens when the patient you are desperately trying to save suddenly becomes a lethal, impossible biohazard, capable of taking down an entire room of highly trained medical professionals in a matter of seconds? Before we get into this terrifying true medical anomaly, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Riverside, California, in the early months of 1994, was a typical, bustling, suburban hub. The weather in February is usually mild, carrying a slight chill in the evening air that forces people to pull their jackets a little tighter. On the evening of Sunday, February 19th, 1994, the atmosphere inside the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital was steady. It was the kind of busy that seasoned medical staff are completely comfortable with. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant quiet tune. The smell of antiseptic floor cleaner hung heavily in the air. Among the staff on duty that night were people who had dedicated their lives to pulling strangers back from the brink of death. There was an attending physician named Dr. Humberto Ochoa, a man who had seen nearly every trauma imaginable. There was a registered nurse named Susan Kane, known for her steady hands and calm demeanor under intense pressure. And there was a senior medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, a brilliant young doctor who was deeply passionate about emergency medicine. They were a well-oiled machine. They were trained to handle absolute panic with clinical detachment. They were not, however, trained to handle the impossible. Just a few miles away from the bright lights of the hospital, a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was living through a nightmare. Gloria was a mother, known to her friends and family as a kind and deeply loving person. But life had recently dealt her an incredibly cruel hand. She had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. The illness had ravaged her body, bringing with it an immense, unrelenting physical pain that shadowed her every waking moment. Despite the treatments and the brave face she put on for her children, her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Earlier that Sunday evening, Gloria began to experience severe distress. She was sitting in her home when a sudden wave of nausea and shortness of breath overtook her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She became deeply confused, her sentences slurring together as she tried to communicate with her terrified family. Realizing that something was catastrophically wrong, they rushed to the phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived quickly. They found Gloria in a state of severe cardiovascular distress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her pulse was racing at a dangerous speed. They immediately loaded her into the back of the ambulance, strapped an oxygen mask over her face to flood her starving lungs with pure oxygen, and began the frantic drive to Riverside General Hospital. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy double doors of the emergency bay burst open. The paramedics rushed the gurney down the hallway, shouting out Gloria's plunging vital signs. The medical team was waiting for them. They immediately directed the gurney into Trauma Room 1, a small enclosed space packed with life-saving equipment. The team swarmed the bed. Dr. Ochoa took command, barking out rapid-fire orders. They needed to stabilize her, and they needed to do it immediately. They quickly injected her with fast-acting sedatives and cardiac drugs designed to slow down a heart that was beating so fast it was failing to pump blood. They pushed Valium and Ativan into her veins. Nothing worked. Her heart rate continued to climb, vibrating in her chest rather than beating. Her lungs were failing. Realizing that she was on the absolute edge of a total collapse, Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to prepare the defibrillator. They needed to deliver a massive electric shock to her chest to reset her heart rhythm. As the nurses moved in to remove Gloria's shirt and place the adhesive defibrillator pads on her chest, a strange, collective pause settled over Trauma Room 1. The medical staff noticed something bizarre. Gloria's skin was covered in an unusual, thick, oily sheen. It did not look like the cold sweat of a dying patient. It looked like a thin layer of grease shining under the harsh overhead lights. At the exact same moment, an incredibly potent and bizarre odor began to fill the small room. It was a sharp, pungent, deeply chemical smell. Some of the nurses later described it as smelling like heavy garlic. Others said it smelled like a mix of ammonia and rotting fruit. It was a smell that made the back of the throat burn. It was a smell that simply did not belong in a sterile, carefully controlled hospital environment. But a patient was slipping away on the table. They could not stop to investigate a strange odor. They had to keep moving. Dr. Ochoa gave the order to draw blood. They needed immediate lab results to figure out what was destroying her organs. Nurse Susan Kane grabbed a fresh syringe, expertly found a vein in Gloria's arm, inserted the needle, and slowly pulled back the plunger. She watched as the dark red blood filled the plastic tube. Susan pulled the vial away, intending to hand it off to a technician. But as she looked at the tube, she froze. She held the vial up to the bright fluorescent lights. Floating inside the dark red liquid were tiny, solid, manila-colored particles. They looked like little crystals. Susan stared at it in complete disbelief. Blood does not crystallize inside the veins of a living human being. It was medically impossible. She leaned in slightly, bringing the vial closer to her face to inspect the bizarre phenomenon. As she did, she caught a direct whiff of the air escaping from the tiny hole at the top of the syringe. Instantly, Susan's face lost all its color. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a stainless steel medical cart. She gasped, telling her colleagues that her face was burning and that the room was violently spinning. Before anyone could reach out to catch her, Susan's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed heavily onto the linoleum floor, completely unconscious. The room erupted. One of the other nurses quickly grabbed Susan by the shoulders and dragged her out of Trauma Room 1, shouting for help. In the chaos, the vial of crystallized blood was handed to the senior resident, Julie Gorkinski. Julie took the warm plastic tube. She looked at the impossible manila crystals floating inside. She too leaned her head down to smell the syringe, trying to identify the chemical odor that was now suffocating the room. A wave of intense, crushing nausea hit Julie like a physical blow. She felt a massive weight pressed down on her chest. The bright lights of the trauma room smeared into blinding streaks. She knew she was about to pass out. She managed to hand the vial to another staff member and staggered out of the room, heading frantically toward the main nurse's station to sit down. She grabbed onto a wooden desk for support, but her legs completely gave out beneath her. Julie collapsed. When her colleagues rushed to her side, they were horrified to see that she was not just unconscious. She was actively seizing. Her body convulsed violently on the hospital floor. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were fixed. Back inside Trauma Room 1, the nightmare was compounding. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was standing at the head of the bed, manually pumping a bag valve mask to force air into Gloria's failing lungs. Maureen felt a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness wash over her entire body. Her arms grew heavy. The beeping monitors faded into a distant echo. She let go of the mask, took 2 unsteady steps away from the bed, and collapsed face first onto the floor. Within a span of just a few minutes, 3 highly trained medical professionals had dropped to the ground, completely incapacitated by an invisible force radiating from the dying woman on the table. The emergency room descended into pure, unadulterated terror. The staff realized that whatever was killing Gloria Ramirez was now airborne, and it was taking them down one by one. The hospital administration was immediately notified. A code was called over the loudspeakers. The order was given to evacuate the entire emergency department. It was a scene of absolute pandemonium. Dozens of patients, some sitting in wheelchairs with broken bones, some bleeding from lacerations, were rushed out of their rooms and wheeled outside into the cold night air of the hospital parking lot. The nurses and doctors set up a makeshift triage center under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. They worked frantically to keep their existing patients alive while simultaneously fleeing the invisible poison that had taken over their building. But inside Trauma Room 1, a small skeleton crew made the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice. Dr. Ochoa and a few brave nurses refused to abandon Gloria. They stayed inside the contaminated zone. They fought a losing battle against her failing heart. They charged the defibrillator and shocked her again and again. They pumped every resuscitation drug they had in the crash cart into her system. They worked in a room that felt like it was actively trying to kill them, taking shallow breaths, fighting through their own dizziness, burning eyes, and overwhelming nausea. Despite their heroic and terrifying efforts, the damage to Gloria's body was too severe. At 8:50 p.m., Dr. Ochoa stepped back from the bed, looked at the flat line on the monitor, and pronounced Gloria Ramirez dead. The medical staff stepped away from her body, exhausted, traumatized, and terrified for their own lives. They carefully stripped off their scrubs, sealed them in hazardous waste bags, and thoroughly scrubbed themselves down in the emergency decontamination showers. The entire emergency room was sealed off behind thick plastic sheeting. The local police arrived, followed quickly by the fire department, and eventually, a specialized hazardous materials team, dressed from head to toe in full containment suits. The hazmat team slowly entered the empty, silent hospital wing. They carried highly sensitive equipment designed to detect radiation, poisonous gas leaks, and chemical weapons. They slowly swept the hallways. They tested the air in Trauma Room 1. They tested the surfaces, the medical equipment, and the ventilation system. They found absolutely nothing. There were no toxic chemicals detected. The hospital was completely baffled. Over the next few days, the investigation widened. The county health department stepped in. When the coroner performed the autopsy on Gloria's body, the level of fear was so high that he and his team had to wear custom-made, fully enclosed aluminum protective suits with their own independent oxygen supplies. They performed the procedure inside a specially built, airtight containment chamber. They took tissue samples, blood samples, and tested her organs for every known toxin. Again, they found no evidence of known poisonous gases, no agricultural pesticides, and no radioactive materials. For a brief, insulting moment, the official ruling from the health department was mass hysteria. The officials suggested that the intense stress of working in the emergency room, combined with a strange but harmless smell, caused the staff to experience a localized psychological breakdown. They claimed the fainting was entirely in their heads. The medical staff was furious. You do not seize from a panic attack. More importantly, Julie Gorczynski, the resident who had handled the blood, spent 2 agonizing weeks in the intensive care unit. She developed severe internal complications. She developed a rare bone condition known as avascular necrosis, which literally caused the bone tissue in her knees to physically die and rot away due to a lack of blood supply. She required months of grueling physical therapy and multiple surgeries just to walk again. A psychological panic attack does not cause human bones to die. Something physical, something incredibly dangerous, had entered their bodies that night. Months later, a complex and terrifying chemical theory finally emerged. It was pieced together by a team of elite scientists at a national laboratory who spent weeks running computer simulations and chemical tests. The theory they proposed suggested a chain of events so unlikely it seemed like dark magic. Gloria was suffering from immense, unending pain due to her advanced cancer. It is highly believed that in her desperation for relief, she may have been using a common home remedy solvent called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, rubbing it directly onto her skin. This solvent is known to be a powerful pain reliever for muscles and joints. It also has a distinct garlic-like odor, and it leaves a thick, oily residue on the skin. This perfectly explained the strange smell and the sheen the nurses noticed when they removed her shirt. But DMSO by itself is not toxic. The deadly transformation happened because of the medical interventions. When the paramedics strapped the oxygen mask to Gloria's face in the ambulance, the intense saturation of pure oxygen in her blood reacted with the DMSO in her system. The oxygen molecules bonded with the solvent, creating a new chemical compound called dimethyl sulfone. Dimethyl sulfone is known to crystallize at room temperature. This perfectly explained the bizarre manila-colored particles Susan Kane saw floating in the blood tube when it hit the cool air of the emergency room. But even dimethyl sulfone is not a deadly poison. The final fatal catalyst happened in Trauma Room 1. When Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to use the defibrillator, the powerful electric shock delivered to Gloria's chest shot through her body and hit the newly formed chemical in her bloodstream. The intense electrical energy rearranged the molecules one last time. It converted the dimethyl sulfone into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an extraordinarily deadly, heavy, invisible poison gas. It is a blistering agent that destroys human tissue on contact. When Susan Kane drew the blood, that deadly gas bubbled out of the liquid. It entered the air of the small, poorly ventilated room, and it instantly poisoned the medical staff who inhaled it. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark and terrifying exploration of the unpredictable nature of our world. It speaks to the lengths a person will go to find relief from unbearable suffering, reaching for any remedy that might offer just a moment of peace. But more profoundly, it reveals how incredibly fragile the boundaries of our safety really are. We build massive fortresses of science and medicine. We believe we can control the variables of life and death with machines and protocols. Yet, a simple sequence of well-intentioned actions seeking comfort, applying oxygen to help someone breathe, trying to restart a failing heart, can accidentally summon a nightmare. It teaches us a grim lesson about the hidden consequences of our actions. It shows us that every choice we make carries unseen ripples, and sometimes the very things meant to save us are the exact things that seal our fate. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned town in the middle of the American Rust Belt where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of urban explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.